They named the child with breath that steamed in the godswood and hands that would not quite stop trembling from work. The heart tree watched and did not blink. Jon took the swaddled bundle from Margaery as if he were accepting a sword that had once belonged to a better man, and together they set the little weight in a hollow between two roots where snow did not linger. Catelyn stood a little apart, chin lifted, the wind sculpting strays of hair against her cheek. Robb beside her had that look he wore when he was trying to keep pride from turning into something that made him stupid. Arya did not bother to hide her grin at the small, angry face. Sansa held Willis's arm and whispered the words of the old prayer so softly Willis could not follow all of them and liked the mystery of it for once. Ghost lay to one side, eyes half-lidded, tail a white question mark on white ground. "Alice," Margaery said, her voice steady as if reading a number she had checked twice before writing. "Alice of Winterfell." She did not look at Jon when she said it, though the name had been shaped between them by nights where neither pretended to sleep when there were lists to be made and bread to be divided and fear to be portioned out so it did not drown a household. She had thought of her grandmother and dismissed Olenna as a name too sharp for a baby. She had thought of her mother and dismissed Allery as a name that would make the North taste of roses when it needed to taste of bacon and smoke. Alice was North enough to belong and smooth enough to fit in a lady's mouth when that lady needed to scold a girl for muddy boots. Jon bent his head and kissed Alice's brow. "The old gods witness," he said simply. "So do we." He raised her and the wind combed her hair with a little hiss, and Alice screwed up her face and announced herself to the trees with a cry like a hawk's first attempt at finding its voice. Afterward, in the warm where men can admit they have feelings without the wind carrying them away, Catelyn came and touched the back of Margaery's hand with 2 fingers. "It sits," she said, meaning the name and the baby and the whole strange arrangement of Wolf and Rose. "It sits better than I thought something new would." Margaery smiled, tired and bright. "We will make a place for her to sit," she said. "If we move 3 benches and send 2 men to the yard so they do not mutter over her cradle." Catelyn's mouth twitched. "You have learned the North," she said. "I have learned your hall," Margaery corrected. "The North is too large to pretend I've mastered anything but where to put the fat on a fire." Alice slept with her fist crooked in the fur at the edge of her cradle, as if already she knew she was meant to hold something. Ghost took to lying under the cradle instead of at the threshold, accepting without consultation a new post as if the pack had enlarged itself and required no comment. When Alice woke with the starving outrage of babies, the white wolf lifted his head and blinked at Margaery until the woman laughed into her palm and said, "All right, old man, I am coming." As if Ghost had been a grandmother minding the timetable, Jon went between the cradle and the wall with a regularity that made men's comments die of boredom before they reached their lips. He took the road north without theatrical farewells because drama tempts disaster and because men who hope to live settle for smaller performances. On the wall, he learned again how to sleep between horn blasts and how to wake without wasting a heartbeat on remembering which world he was in. At Winterfell, he learned again how to eat slowly even when hunger had made a tyrant of his stomach, because Alice would stop and look around the hall with that intense newborn concentration, and the whole of Winterfell would remember to breathe with her. On a night when the wind went from knife to saw and back again, Jon dreamed under the heart tree and thought he heard his father say his name. Not Snow, not Sun, the old shape of it, the one that belonged to a younger man and a war fought for things that had music in their names. He woke with sap on his palm and the taste of cold iron in his mouth. When he told Margaery, not because he wanted to and not because he needed comfort, but because a man tells the person who keeps his lists what he is keeping, she said, "Then we will count an extra tally of arrows for tomorrow," as if dreams too could be entered into a ledger and made less by being shared. The next raven came from the south with its feathers sticky from having been caught at least twice by hands that had second thoughts. Garland wrote from a camp not far from the Mander where the earth had started to refuse the print of hooves. So many had pressed it. The Lannister host near Ashmark had cracked along a vein of fear when the weight of paying for 2 wars had begun to show on men's faces at supper. Cersei had armed a faith she did not understand, and it had learned to like the sound of its own cudgels. The Reach had fed itself and the riverlands beyond itself and had not sent more grain to the city, and the city had eaten pride with its thin stew. "We can do this without the lion," Garland wrote, In that calm way he had that made a statement about breaking a great house feel like a matter of untying a knot. But I would rather do it with the North's eyes watching our backs. Robb sent back his yes in a hand that had learned to be equal parts king and clerk. He did not break his army to march south. He sent men who could speak for him and men who could read a field and men who could scout without leaving footprints in a mind. He wrote to the Blackfish and to Jason Mallister and to Brynden Tully's old enemies with the tone of a man who expects obedience because he is giving them something larger than his person to obey. Roose Bolton sent nothing and received nothing and began to look at his son, as if he might be a leash staining his glove. Bran came to Winterfell between one breath and the next, the way a bird comes to a branch when you have not seen it in the sky and then it is simply there. Men saw him first in their dreams. A boy by the kitchens told Margaery he had dreamed of a tree that sang in a woman's voice and felt unembarrassed when he woke. A girl with a scar on her lip told Arya, scowling, that she had dreamed her knife had roots and that they were not a nuisance but useful. Jon woke to the sense of being observed by something that did not judge and did not forgive and did not adore and did not, most importantly, miss anything. He went to the Godswood because that is where a man goes when a thing that is larger than him has asked him to come without words. Bran stood near the heart tree with his hands on the bark, eyes far and near at once. He looked like a boy who had learned to carry a weight no child should lift and found he could do it and not be crushed by it and would not receive a medal for it and did not need one. Mira Reed stood at his shoulder with a spear in her hand and mud on her boots, smiling the way people smile when they have come home and are not yet certain they are allowed to be pleased. "Brother," Jon said, and the word was a generosity and a truth both. Bran blinked and focused. His mouth twitched into something that was not quite a smile and yet made Jon want to laugh. "It was very cold," he said without preface. "You told me it would be." "I am sorry," Jon said, ridiculous apology, and Bran shook his head. "It was not your fault that the world is what it is," Bran said, and then looked past Jon to where Margaery stood under a bare-limbed branch with Alice clutched to her like a warm secret. "Hello," Bran told the baby solemnly. "I am your uncle. I have seen you already in a place where your name rises like bread if you keep it warm." Alice yawned, as if unimpressed by uncles who were also trees. Catelyn came slowly, each step a conversation with bones and memory. She stopped short. Her hands rose and then dropped. "Brandon," she whispered, and then did what proud women do when they cannot maintain their pride without breaking something. She put both hands out and allowed a boy to take them, and when he put his cheek against her knuckles, she allowed herself to make a sound that came from a room she had kept locked and had not dusted for years. "He will come to the wall," Bran said later to Jon in a quiet room where the fire had learned their preferences and did not spit. "Not because he wants to, because the cold remembers what it used to be and wants it back. The path is not the one men are watching. It is the one old women step into empty pots." "We will watch both," Jon said. "Can you tell me whether the South has learned anything?" Bran's eyes went distant and then not. "They have learned that crowns are heavy," he said. "They have learned that hunger makes men pious. They have learned that fire burns too quickly to warm a house for long. Some of them have remembered that ships float or sink together, and some of them still think they can walk on water if they shout mine loudly enough." "Choose," Jon said. "Which lesson do we help?" "The one that brings us bread," Bran said, practical as old Nan. "Then we will help the ones who remember that ships float together," Jon said. "We will feed who we can and burn who we must." Willis and Sansa set their seeds in waiting beds behind the glass of frames Margaery had built 3 weeks earlier in defiance of anyone's opinion about what was worth wood and men's time. When the little green pushed up, Sansa clapped like a girl and then looked over her shoulder, embarrassed, and Willis said very seriously, "It is good to clap for living things. They are shy. You ought to encourage them." And Sansa laughed and did it again louder just to spite the part of her that had learned to hide joy. Arya took lessons from Mira and gave lessons back. Mira showed her how to walk into a swamp without taking the swamp home on her legs. Arya showed her how to move in a crowd without the crowd noticing the loss of a purse. Between them, they found a rhythm that made men who liked tidy categories feel itchy. Theon Greyjoy went to Pike with 3 men who had sworn to him because he had not lied to them when it would have been smoother. Balon Greyjoy had fallen from a rope bridge fighting no man but the wind. No one believed it had been only wind. Euron had come in on a tide that smelled of spice and iron and old things, laughing. He had laughed the islands into a kingsmoot and laughed his niece's better claim off the wet rocks and laughed until the men who had come to shout found themselves shouting the thing that would get them a better share of other people's pain. Asha, Yara to men who had learned to pronounce words without C in their mouths, had gone east to find ships where the world grew exotic and angry. Theon came and did not make speeches. "I know who you are," Euron told him mildly, while a woman with hair like wet kelp played a tune on some strange pipe that sounded like drowned men trying to explain their mistakes. "You like to laugh. You like to think in bed while you were not asleep and imagine that thinking made you cleverer than the men who simply snored. You were always someone else's nephew. Now you are a dog to a wolf. It is an improvement. Dogs live longer than gulls. I am here to tell you what happens when you scratch the north," Theon said, as if delivering a message no messenger ought to survive and knowing it. "It bites. You have not fought anything that eats the way winter eats. You plan for men. You should plan for something that wants your bone marrow for soup." Euron smiled with half his mouth. "I have a horn that calls old gods," he said, and Theon made himself not glance at the thing on a table that looked like trouble had learned to take a shape. "I have ships whose planks have touched waters you cannot find in your brother's songs. I have a priest for a brother and I put him in his place. Do you bring me anything but a warning? I bring you a way to live," Theon said. "Pull your fingers back from the north and they will not be broken. Turn your eyes to men who have always fought at sea, and you will learn something your father forgot. If you raid a shore where the people have decided to be one house because they have to be, you will die. If you raid a shore where men are still deciding whether they are brothers, you may live long enough to choke on your own jokes." Euron laughed again. It was like hearing a sail split. "Perhaps I will come and see your north when the dead have made it a cemetery where the stones look like ships' sails in a storm. We will sail between them and sing, and I will put a cup on the head of your lord and shoot it off without spilling." Theon thought of Jon's hand on his shoulder and of Margaery's list that had his name on it under things to be used, not broken, and of Alice's small breath, and of the weight of the sea when it decides it will not explain itself. "If you come," he said, "I will show you a white wolf. You will not laugh then." Euron raised his cup, amused enough to honor insolence. "Show me," he said. "We shall see whether your white is the sort that accepts stains." Davos returned with the smell of salt under his nails and a boy who made men straighten their backs without knowing they had. Rickon had learned to ride between Winterfell and White Harbor without falling because Osha had taught him to grip with his knees and insult the horse until the beast respected him. Davos brought letters too. Wyman's oaths like pies, heavy with hidden meats. Manderly's accounts like ship's manifests solid. Lord Hornwood's cramped hand, desperate and frank. Lord Serwyn's neat page saying simply yes. He brought a message from Stannis that read like law. "Meet me where the road from the Dreadfort forks, and we will show a man that kindness ends at convenience." They met Roose Bolton where the road forked because Roose preferred to be the man who led people to places where choices could be dressed up as curiosities. The field had been snow the day before and was ice by dawn. Men went down if they trod on old footsteps. Meege Mormont arrived with axes that had seen 3 generations of northern temper. Great John roared himself hoarse and did not stop. The Glovers came quiet and left louder. The Umbers split one banner and carried it doubled for luck. The mountain clans slipped through the tree shadows as if the forest were a paper screen and they had been drawn on it in ink. Ramsay did what Ramsay did. Set fires where the smoke would blow into his enemy's eyes, skinned a man wrong for information and learned nothing but his own taste, tried to break a line where it was strongest because he did not have the patience to find where it was weakest. Roose did what Roose did. Measured, cut, waited, tried to make the North die of judgeship instead of blood. Jon did what he had learned to do. Put men where their pride would be most useful and not let them make it into a poem. He held the right with the Mormonts until Stannis came on from the left like a man bringing the law to a brawl, tight ranks, few shouts, the thud of discipline. He did not like the umber's noise, but used the way it made other men forget to be clever. At noon the wind turned and took Ramsay's smoke into his own men's faces, and they coughed and cursed and went blind at the exact moment Manderley's men hit their flank in a broad piece of theater designed by a fat man who knew how to make a point. Roose saw the truth of the day as it rolled toward him like a barrel he had not asked for. The North had decided to be one thing. He could not be king of it if it would not permit kings. He could be flayed on it. He chose to leave. He left Ramsay to learn a lesson men like him refuse to admit exists. That leaving a dog untied in a yard full of men who hate him is not a kindness. Ramsay died in a ditch with snow in his mouth, and no one wrote a song. Roose fled to the Dreadfort and sat in a chair and thought about the shape of power, and how sometimes the only way to keep a chair from being pulled out from under you is to admit you have no right to it. He wrote a letter to Robb that no one expected. It said, "If I kneel, will my blood be allowed to continue to serve?" And the North sent back in Robb's hand and Jon's heavy with being copied in Margaery's ink because she held the quill when the men faltered. "Kneel. Serve. Be counted. Be watched." In the Riverlands, men entered the Twins with careful hats and left with new lives because Walder Frye had learned finally that rumor is a bill that comes due with interest. Wyman Manderley's pies had made more impression than his sermons. Men told their cousins their children might marry into Frye bread and not Frye betrayal after all. Not because Walder had become good, but because he had become afraid of his own story. The river muttered along the foundations with that patient threat water keeps for those who forget its work. In King's Landing, a woman walked through a crowd with bare feet, and the city watched the residue of pride stick to her instead of the street and had feelings about it they could not name. The boy with the crown signed papers and could not control which guards took orders from which men with beards. The faith lined its pockets with the ease of men who think they have found a better word for taxes. A Tyrell in the capital who had always preferred spice to salt began to weigh whether a southern harvest had become an exercise in feeding men who would spit in the hand that fed them. Olenna wrote to Margaery without couriers, because the old sometimes write to the living with their thinking, and Margaery felt the letter like a warmth on her cheek when she stood too close to the oven. "We will not come north to be guests. We will come north to be kin, because that is where people will be allowed to remain people when the dead get tired of playing at being soldiers." The glass candle in the high tower burned sometimes with a light that made men argue whether it was green or blue, and in its glow Sam read a page in a book that itched his fingers. Dragonglass, obsidian, the names of volcanoes written in old hands that had never seen the north and had yet felt it in their joints. He wrote to Margaery, "If the smiths can learn to bind obsidian in iron without shattering it, the stocks we have may carry you through a season. If the men at Dragonstone are willing to trade stone for grain, the season after. If we remember that our grandfathers' tools were not useless because they were grandfathers, perhaps the season beyond." She wrote back, "We will send you iron and patience. Teach the smiths to love ugly." Bran began to speak in meetings sometimes, a word here, a nod there that made an old lord stop in the middle of a sentence and reconsider what he had thought was right because a boy had looked at him through the eyes of a tree. When men asked him for prophecies, he shrugged and said, "I am a boy who climbed and fell and learned how to see from a different branch. If you want a future, make it, and I will tell you which stones will bruise your feet." Sansa walked Winterfell with Willis and learned the hallways again. Not as a girl who had darted about the skirts of feasts, but as a woman who intended not to trip over griefs that had been stored in corners like broken chairs. She took on the household's voices, settled disputes before they curdled into injuries, wrote to Oldtown for 3 books and to White Harbor for 12 bolts of cloth and to Highgarden for seeds that would not root if you did not sing to them, and sang to them because it was necessary. She learned to braid Margaery's hair and afterward to braid Alice's when the girls tuffed D become a small proud madness. She made Arya sit long enough to learn 3 new stitches on a seam that would hold a man's shirt sleeve through a winter's day, and Arya repaid her by showing her how to shift a knife from hand to hand without anyone noticing until it rested between your fingers as if it belonged there because your mind belonged to you. Great John taught Rickon a roar that would shake bread out of a mouse's paws. Margaery taught him to count to 40 without becoming bored and deciding 40 could be replaced with many. Jon taught him how to grip a hilt and not to cut air for applause. Osha taught him to lose a fight and not to sulk. Bran taught him to listen to silence. Catelyn taught him to thank the woman who set the stew down before the Lord who blessed it. The first long thaw came not as a grace but as a test, no less severe than any storm. Roofs wept and men took to ladders. Ice buckled and took a fool in its mouth and taught the village a song they did not want. Roads turned to batter. Tempers rose on steam. Margaery sent men with sand and the old women with rules to the bathing tubs so boys would not take this for a time to pretend they were seals. She sent girls with buckets to the corners where basements leak. She sent bread in loaves to 3 hamlets that had not asked and 2 that had, and 1 that had lied about needing it because it was easier to lie than to admit bad management. Men muttered about excess and then later about how the hall knew their needs better than they had, and then later still they did not mutter because their mouths were full. A raven came to the wall and could not find a landing for the men swarming the yard. It settled on Ghost's back as if deciding White was safe enough and suffered itself to be carried in like an unlikely standard. Jeor Mormont's hand was heavy on the page. East, farther than the maps care to show, but near enough that the wind carries the smell of it. Jon took his furs and his bow and his dragonglass, and he went because that is the answer to such letters. He came back with a frostburned cheek and with a story that made the men in the hall sit very quietly. There had been a thing on the ice that moved like a shadow rearranging itself, and within it shapes that did not care about the men watching. Men had shot and the arrows had done what arrows do to fog. Melisandre had stood with her arms up and cried out words that made the hair on a man's forearms rise and had become very still and very small afterward, as if a price had been charged, and she had paid part of it immediately and part of it was waiting for her somewhere when she had stopped thinking about it. Stannis had commanded and had been obeyed, and afterwards had stood looking at the fire with a face that had not learned to be grateful for survival. "This is not victory," he had said to Jon as men slept in heaps like dogs, and the wind had moved the tent walls with hands that had become almost gentle. "This is a delay. I am good at those. We will need men who are better at endings." Jon had said, "We are not there yet," and Stannis had grimaced, which for him is a smile. He found Alice asleep with one hand flung above her head in the shape of a question mark, and he put his finger under her palm because he had become superstitious about small rituals that made sense to no one but him and perhaps the gods if they were bored. She gripped as if offended at being disturbed, then let go as if forgiving him. Margaery watched from the doorway with hair hanging like a flag let down and said nothing, because words are scarce in the hour when what you love is sleeping and you are awake to guard it. When he looked up at her, she came and set her forehead to his, and neither of them pretended not to be simply relieved. Word came from the Vale at last, not a word but a ship, because the Vale prefers to arrive with its own weather. Yohn Royce brought men with hard faces and hands that had never become soft. He brought a letter with a signature from a boy lord who had learned, under the guidance of a man with cold eyes, to write in a straight line. He brought no little finger, which was how men knew something had gone right. "We are late," Royce said to Robb without excuse, which was in itself a kind of apology. "We are here. We will hold the mountain pass and send men who know where the snow lies in wait. We will carry letters on foot where a horse will not do." "We needed you," Robb said. "Yesterday." "You need us tomorrow," Royce said. "Lucky for you I live there." Garland wrote from the south. Casterly Rock had shut its gates not out of pride but out of lack of ideas. The Golden Tooth had lost some sheen. The Boy King's council met and disagreed and drank. The Faith had learned that humility is a weapon with a blade men forget to watch for. He wrote in the last line, tight, as if he had almost not included it. "Loras plays soldier where singing would serve us better. I love him and he will be the death of himself if no one tells him to sit." Olenna wrote to Margaery, "He is a good boy with a bad habit of forgetting that good boys die for bad reasons. If you can think of a better reason, write it to him and he might listen." Margaery wrote back to Loras an inventory of Winterfell's stable roofs, as if he had asked for it. At the bottom she wrote, "If you love your sword, put it where it keeps men warm." He wrote back a rude picture of a stable roof with a sword leaning romantically against it and underlined it 3 times, and then used her list to quarter a garrison in a little river town that would have starved without reach bread and would have been burned if any man had been allowed to call it an accomplishment to ride in with torches. The dragon did not come. The raven from a city across the sea that had been in men's mouths like a rumor for a year now did not arrive. Jon had never learned to expect dragons. He did not build a portion of work for them to do into his lists. He spoke to the smiths about obsidian and the files. He spoke to the maester about counting oil. He spoke to his wife about bread. He sent Sam a bag of nails and a prayer for the kind of luck that comes to men who have set their minds on a piece of work no one else thinks possible. Sam sent back a queerly cut knife that looked like it would break if you breathed on it and did not break when a man put it into a thing that hated warmth. Men stopped laughing at ugly things. One evening Alice pulled herself up on the bench and stood with her legs locked in the ridiculous pride of all creatures who have discovered a new trick and assume the world wanted them to possess it. She fell a moment later. Margaery laughed so hard she had to sit down on the floor beside the cradle, and the baby laughed like someone old and wicked delighted by a story told by a younger friend. Jon, who had seen men lose legs that day on the wall, laughed with relief so pure it embarrassed him. "You will go again," Margaery said that night, when the fire had learned to be a friend again and not a tool. "You will go until you cannot. You will come back. I will make sure there is something to come back to. And not a story about a lady who counted flour until her hands fell off and then a man had to write her a song." "You will not get a song from me," Jon said. "You will get bread." "I like bread," she said, and pulled him down to the bed by his sleeve with the authority of a woman who has allowed herself, after many months of making lists that contained nothing but other people's names, to put her own at the bottom and leave a space for what she needed. At dawn, Bran came to the yard and put his hand on the wolf's head. Ghost stilled, as if remembering that he had once run in a forest with a boy who had dropped from a tower and then had fallen into a tree and become something the wolves had always half understood. Bran looked at Jon and said, "South." And Jon felt the old habit of disobedience rise like a starved dog and then subside, satisfied with a scrap. "Not far," Bran added. "Not to fight, to listen. There is a whisper in the Riverlands that has not been allowed to become a voice." Jon went with 3 men, and Arya went with him because Arya does not ask, and men have learned to be grateful for her disobedience when it has saved their lives 3 times out of 4. They rode the old King's Road where it remembered itself after frost. They slept in a burned mill and in a farmer's loft and once in a ditch because the farmer had been beaten for kindness the week before and could not take another payment in the same coin. They came upon a village where 2 banners hung out of the same window, a fish and a rose battered. The village had learned to be poor without losing manners. A woman came to the door and put water in a jug, as if she would be ashamed to let strangers drink out of the bucket. "Tell me what you need," Jon said, and the woman laughed like a door creaking, not out of mockery but out of a habit hard on joy. "Need?" she said. "To be left alone, to be remembered, to be told when the dead are coming so we can take our asleep out of the hall before we have to wake with them. Bread. So, a man with a broad back to fix the beam that bowed last winter. A reason to teach my boy not to steal. A knife that will stay sharp through a season. What do you have?" "A list," Jon said, "and a wife who will honor it. We can do 3 things. The beam, the soap, the knife. The reasons we will keep working on." Later, when he stood in a church that had forgotten whether it had been built for 7 or for 1, and had become simply a place where the air remembers how to be quiet, he heard a whisper like river water over stones. It said names he had known and names he had not. It said, the boy at the fords, the old man who writes in his sleep, the woman who counts babies' breaths for a living, the fry who wants to die somewhere no one will find his bones, the sister who carried her brother's sword for a mile when he was too tired to do it and then handed it to him without telling him she had done the brave thing. He came home with the feeling of having dipped a cup and carried water to a place that had been very thirsty and still needed a river. He found Stannis there, sitting awkwardly in a chair that had been built for a man who expected to be comfortable sometimes. He had a map on his knee that had been smoothed and smoothed until it had learned the shape of his thigh. Melisandre stood behind him like a shadow with better posture. "South," Stannis said without looking up. "North," Jon replied, and Stannis's mouth did that painful thing that allowed a smile to get to his eyes by the shortest route. "We will be finished then," Stannis said. "With the small things, at least." "We will never be finished," Jon said, and Stannis nodded, which was as close as he had ever come to affection. The last great push of the dead came not with ceremony but with weather. The clouds developed a thickness that made men's ears ring. The first blue eye appeared where men had thought there were only shadows. The first spear of ice broke in a man's neck, and the man did not fall until it had seeped cold into the place where breath decides. Then he fell and rose, and the man beside him put fire into him without shouting, because shouting wastes air. They met it at the night fort because the night fort deserved to have a good story told about it after so many tales in which it had been the friend of children's nightmares. The black gate in the cellar said its word, and Bran said it back to it, and the door learned that a boy can be a brother if he has been buried under enough roots. Men ringed the yard with fires that did not boast. Women stood behind them with water on kettles and fat on the boil and knives to cut cloth, and other things if the moment insisted. Melisandre lifted her arms only once and then did the rest of her work quietly, because fire is a better servant when it is not admired aloud. Stannis held a line and did not budge. Robb came up with the umbers in a rush that made even the dead look up, if they looked at all. Ghost gleamed like a mistake, the kind that saves your life. Jon found that his body had learned a conversation with Dragonglass his mind did not have to oversee. Men died. The right men died, which is to say the ones who had been alive too long to pretend, old, useful, generous, tired, and the wrong ones too, which is to say boys and men who had done nothing yet but hold a line where it needed holding. The dead stopped. They did not retreat. They became not there with the absence that frightens children when a parent goes out without saying where and for how long. In their place was air. The air was very cold. Men put their hands out to the fires like beggars to charity and did not miscount their fingers afterward. Jon looked up into the sky that night and saw, beyond breath and colored light and the peculiar way sound carries on a cold plain, the outline of a world that had not ended and did not promise to continue without being watched. He wanted, suddenly and simply, to sit at a table and be bored by an argument about the proper angle of a ridge beam. He went home and did exactly that. Lara and the smith and Willis and Maester Luwin argued for an hour about a beam. Alice threw a spoon and hit her father on the knee and was affronted by the way the hall laughed. Margaery wrote 3 pages and then tore one and then rewrote 2 because she had found a better way to say the complicated thing the men could not figure out how to hear. Sansa sang in a corner where no one could see and then, remembering Margaery's letter to a different girl in a different city, took 2 steps forward into the light and sang there, and men went quiet not out of manners but because the sound did something to their spines. Spring came in pockets like coins found in old coats. The river bulged and came back gentle. A woman put a hand on a calf's flank and felt life that made her grin. An old man set a chair by a window and fell asleep there and woke and did it again, which meant something. Wyman Manderley sent a pie north with a flag stuck in it for Alice because he had decided to be a grandfather to any child who would have him. Olenna sent a basket of little knitted caps with ears because the old sometimes have the courage to be silly. Willis sent a hawk's bell with a note, for when she runs away. Sansa rolled her eyes and hid a smile. Arya sharpened knives and wrote 3 names on a wall and then crossed them out without killing anyone because they were not men anymore but habits, and habits can be starved. Euron came no farther than the mouth of the Mander that season. He took 3 ships and lost one and told a story that made his men think they had one. He drank with a woman who had a strange tattoo and laughed when she told him the North had called his bluff because the North had not heard it. And later, when he sat alone with a cup and looked at the inside of it, he frowned because frowning is what men do when they are not as brave as their laughter suggested. Castle Black built a new barracks with a roof that did not groan. Eastwatch carved new steps into the cliff face that did not crumble under men who had spent their lives in the wrong shoes. The Manderleys built a granary in a hamlet that had never had one because it had never had enough grain to require it. Men cried when they saw it and pretended it was the wind. In the Gift, fields got turned that had not known iron in a decade and remembered what they were for with humility. The Reach sent plowshares and seed and men who knew the difference between soil that was merely being obstinate and soil that had a rock sulking under it. The North sent fish and wool and a patience that turned foreign complaints into jokes. Robb set down a crown on a day when no one was looking and wiped the place on his brow where it had sat and felt the weight like a phantom. He let the crown sit on the head of a carved wolf in the great hall for 3 days and no one stole it and no one polished it. And then he put it back on his head because the men liked to see it where it belonged. He met Stannis halfway down a page with a sentence they could both read. They did not love each other. They did not pretend to. They gave each other a place to stand that was wider than either had thought he would ever be allowed. Jon went to the God's Wood with Alice on his shoulder and put her hand against the bark because a girl should know what bark feels like before she is old enough to be embarrassed about sap. Margaery came and stood under the thin first leaves and breathed the air that had not earned its sweetness yet and would soon. They stood a while not because they expected a vision or an admonition or a song, but because silence has become rare currency in places where men have lived so loudly. Alice made a soft noise and slept against her father's neck, which is a kind of blessing the gods might envy. "Do you remember the tea?" Margaery asked suddenly, smiling sideways. "What tea?" Jon said, and then he saw the canvas, old and cream-colored, in his mind. The bees. The old woman's eyes that had known the edges of other people's certainties and had learned to enjoy pushing at them. "I remember," he said. "I remember a coffer and a ring without a stone and a promise that was not about a wedding. We kept it," Margaery said. "We did better than keep it. We spent it properly." He reached for her hand and she let him have it, and the three of them stood there, a man and a woman and a child under a tree older than the songs men think are the oldest thing. In a city far away, a boy king signed something and did not understand what he had done. In a tower, a bright candle burned and an old man leaned forward until his nose touched the glass. In a river, a fish jumped and an old woman said aloud, "Good," though she had no audience but a cat. On a ship, a man laughed and then stopped and did not know why. Winter was not over. It never is, not entirely. But bread rose. The dead learned to keep to their side of a line drawn in fire and stubbornness. Men remembered that a wife is not a banner, and a wolf is not a scepter, and a rose is not a reason. Children learned to tie their shoes with fingers that had not been taken by frost. The lists still hung on nails by the kitchen door and on the post by the gate, and they got shorter and shorter again, and the people of Winterfell learned that this too is a form of victory. At dusk, Jon sat at the long table and wrote in a careful hand the things that had been done and the things that needed doing and the names of the people who would do them, and then under the lists he wrote, "For no one's eyes but his own." Alice laughed. Bran smiled. Arya kept her knives sharp. Sans ça sent. Robb breathed with the weight on him and did not stagger. Stannis did not smile and meant it as a favor. Ghost slept under the cradle. Margaery slept at last. For an hour, her hair like the edge of a map I have learned to read. He sanded the page and closed the book and went to sleep in a hall where men snored and women breathed, and a baby, who would one day be bored by this room, sighed in her dreams the way a leaf in a northern spring sighs when the wind finds it. When the horn blew again, as it will, and the dead remembered their duties, as they do, the people in that hall would rise and fetch their tools and go out into a cold that had not been invited and do what needed doing. They would come back. They would count. They would lay another line of stones on top of an old wall and knock down a different piece that should never have been built. They would, in other words, live. And if any god or ghost or stubborn old woman deem a dead a better story than that, Winterfell would tell them to sit down, eat, and learn why bread is a holier thing than prophecy.